Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Shannon Walker. I am with the North Carolina Maritime Museum down in Southport, so not the local one, but the one about 2.5 hours away from here. If you're here for the orientation film for Fort Macon, I suggest you go over to the other room right here. We're going to talk about Venus flytraps today, specifically the the history of how they were discovered and how they became a bit of a craze in the 18th century, at least a bit of a craze for a few people. So not to the level of tulip fever, earlier in history, but this was amongst the scientists and the who's who of the Enlightenment. This was a big deal, this little plant. And so my title is A Curiosity Grows in Carolina, otherwise known as the Tale of the Tippity Witchet. Tippity Witchet is one of the many names for the Venus flytrap. All right, so here we have some fly traps actually taken, pictures taken in my yard. The Venus flytrap, its Latin name is Dianea. I cannot pronounce this correctly, please forgive me. Muscipula. Historical names for it: catchfly sensitive, tippity witchet, tippity twitchet, meadow clam, Venus flytrap. So a variety of different names for it, but most of us know it as, Venus mousetrap. Most of us know it as the Venus flytrap today. So it makes its home here in the wet pine savannas of southeastern North Carolina and northeastern South Carolina. And it lives in areas where the soils are lacking or low in phosphorus and nitrogen and very acidic. So it has to grow in a special type of environment in order to thrive. If you were to transplant fly traps and move them into an area with rich soil with a lot of organic matter in it, they're going to die. And it's because their system cannot handle that. And I found that it's pretty easy to determine if you're in an area where Venus flytraps are growing because of the way the ecosystem around it looks. Certain other plants grow in that area. All right, so we're going to look at their range, both their historical range and their current range. Growing up, and when I was in college, I would hear folks saying like, oh, well, it grows in a 100-mile radius of Wilmington, North Carolina. Well, it really doesn't grow in a 100-mile radius because it would be in the ocean and they're not growing there. But it's about somewhere between 50 and 100 miles, depending on the area. You'll notice, let me see a little, there we go. So our closest little cluster right here is in the Croatan National Forest. You've got a little bit more over in this area. And then our furthest western ranges were over here in Hope County. So up basically on Fort Bragg. That's the furthest west they're living. You'll see the red ones are some of the historic areas where they were, and they are no longer in that area. So you've got your big clusters here along 17, really big one down here where I live, which is in the Southport, Bowling Spring Lakes area, and then that big cluster right there. And then you'll see here on this map, it's just a general, like we're going down, I put this one because it shows South Carolina. So we're not fully getting down to Charleston, but close. So we're pretty much staying along 17 here. All right, so your Venus flytraps, they are flesh-eating plants. So they're carnivorous plants. That doesn't mean that they don't use sunlight in order to create food. They also engage in photosynthesis as well, but they supplement their diet, which they cannot get from the soil, by eating things, eating other insects. And they're not like Little Shop of Horrors. They're not, grabbing on and munching and then swallowing it down. They don't have a digestive tract. They use enzymes to help kind of break down the insects that they're eating, and they absorb what they need from that. So inside, and you can't really see it very well on these pictures, I should have picked a different one, but inside the traps here, you have 3 little hairs that line it. And when an insect gets inside of it, it doesn't have to be an insect, but if an insect gets inside of it, and it triggers one of the hairs, the plant senses that, and it's kind of on the ready. And then if it hits 2 of them within just a few seconds, that's when it gets the signal to start to close. And it basically works the same way that your brain works when you have, you sense something, like you need to move your arm. Um, you have a chemical reaction, the neurons communicate with each other. That's sort of the way the fly traps work, but they're not using neurons. There's electrical signals. And then as the insect continues to struggle, the fly trap will then close further. Once it does that, it starts to hermetically seal, and it takes a few days, and it will start to dissolve that insect. And once it's done, it kind of slowly opens like this and will release. And then you'll see the exoskeleton of whatever it consumed here. And it's Venus flytraps, and a study was done a few years back. I believe it was in 2016. Actually, I'll get to that in just a little bit. I'll talk about it right now. It was done in 2016, and it was to determine what are they eating the same bugs that pollinate them. So, or what consumes, what is in their diet that they consume. They're more apt, they're not so much eating the flies. They're more apt to eat spiders, ants, and beetles. Those are what makes up the bulk of its diet. However, there are some beetles that it doesn't eat. Those are usually their pollinators, but I'll get to that in just a minute. Ironically, though, this is what I usually talk about in my spiel. They don't normally eat flies. I do have them growing wild in my yard. And the other day I looked at one and it had eaten a fly. So I don't know how that happened, but it did. All right, talking about their life cycle. They start with these tiny, tiny little black seeds. They're about the size of a grain of coffee, not a super fine ground, but maybe a medium ground. And the seeds are not viable for very long. So you can't harvest Venus flytrap seeds and then take them, put them in a little bag and store them for next year. They're not going to be viable for that long. They need to be planted as soon as possible. So this little batch right here, this was about after 2 weeks of growing. And you'll notice that they've all got tiny little traps. So they're ready to go. They're ready to eat. And of course, penny for scale right here. These guys right here are a little over a year old. And again, I put my penny right there. See, they also have their little traps and they're ready to go. There's also a sundew for scale. They're very tiny as well. And you can see over here with this guy, the traps have basically what looks sort of like a bulb, a corm on the bottom. And they will wind up dividing over time, just like daffodils do. So you'll get multiple plants in a cluster. And in this case, I was taking these guys and separating them so I could help them be a little bit more healthy by spreading them out. So that's why I was bringing those up. Again, these are in my yard. These are not wild traps. Well, they are wild, but they're on my property. And then you'll see right here, this is each of the traps is on the end of a leaf. And when they start to grow, they kind of unfold like that, and then they'll open up. Right now, we are in Venus flytrap flowering season. So if you know what you're looking for and you're looking in the right spot, you can easily find them at this time of year. You have a stalk that grows about 5 or 6 inches. It depends on the light, but 5 or 6 inches. And you'll have a little white flower that's on top. It's in clusters. So you usually get about a bloom a day. So this guy's just starting the bloom. And then you've got your little flowers right here. See, big stalk, little tiny plant. I forgot to say that your Venus flytraps are not very big at all. So a little rosette averages usually about that if it's maybe about 6 or 7 years old, and only about that tall. So they're little guys. So like about 2.5, 3 inches maybe. They get a little bigger at the end of summer. So they're little fellas. So at this time of year, if you're going to a spot that does have Venus flytraps, this is the easy way to spot them by looking for the flowers. All right, and so here we have some of the seeds. So after your flowers are done, I've got a little spider hanging right here. After the flowers are done flowering, they've been pollinated, you get your tiny little seeds. And here we have some of our end of summer traps, so you can see how big these guys get. And actually, let me go back to our. So the flowers, they have to be pollinated. Now, they don't really do that well with self-pollination. They can, that does happen, but you're going to get a better crop by using cross-pollination. So the insects that predominantly do the pollination are normally checkered beetles, green sweat bees, and longhorn beetles. And there was a study done in 2016 in Pender County where you had a group of scientists from NC State. They observed 200 fly traps. And I believe this was at Holly Shelter. And they counted all the insects that they saw in these 200 fly traps over a period of time. This was May and June of 2016. And this is where they determined that the checkered beetles, the green sweat bees, and the longhorn beetles were the major pollinators. However, even though I am not a scientist, I'm a historian, I found that my local fly traps, I see a lot of sweat bees, but I don't necessarily see many checkered beetles or longhorn beetles. I see a lot of tumbling flower beetles. So it might depend on the location of what bug is pollinating them. Regardless, these three guys here, they rarely ever found them in the traps. They were just pollinators for these. And then your friendly neighbors for your fly traps, they grow in a specific type of ecosystem. If you see these plants here, that I have a list of some of your low growing ones, your taller ones, and then your bigger ones, your trees, and you're in Southeastern North Carolina, there might be a high possibility that you might see some Venus flytraps. So things like bog Cheetos, which are the orange guys, these orange milkworts, pincushion flowers, bladderworts, pitcher plants, gallberry, cinnamon ferns, longleaf pine, swamp magnolia. They all are in the proper ecosystem for these carnivorous plants to grow. And so there's a picture of a few of them as well. Some of these, some of these taken in my yard, some of them in the green swamp. All right, so now on to the history. I just wanted to set the stage for you about what these plants are. So we're going to talk a bit about one of my favorite people. So this is Peter Collinson. He was a 18th century London cloth merchant, and he was a Quaker. And he, like me, okay, I'm a historian, and however, I have a strong interest in the sciences. He was a cloth merchant, and he also had a strong interest in the science. So this was his hobby. This is what he enjoyed studying. And he wound up having strong connections between the who's who of scientists in Europe at the time, even though his day job was a cloth merchant. He had originally hoped to become a scientist, but because he was a Quaker living in England at this time, he was barred from attending a number of the Anglican universities that were there. There was a possibility he could have gone to Edinburgh, which would have accepted him. But his father was in the cloth business. They were doing well. So that is why he decided to go into. However, he still continued to pursue his scientific love. He joined the Royal Society in his 30s. He agreed also to be an unpaid agent for Benjamin Franklin's subscription library. So this was an effort to send books to the colonies to help folks become more learned. So he's told them, like, I will send you books in a hope that he could possibly get somebody in the colonies to send him plants because they have access to things that he doesn't. And being that he's a merchant, he has access to ships in order to get these things, get them sent over to him. So that was his hope. And so he was introduced to a fellow named John Bartram through the secretary of this library. And it would be a 40-year relationship that he would have with John Bartram in regard to the plant world. They never met each other, but they were constantly in correspondence with each other. Now, John Bartram, I don't have an image of him. I don't think one exists. However, this is his house. He was well-to-do, even though folks at the time thought of, like Collinson, thought of him as, oh, just a farmer who lived in Pennsylvania. He was Quaker, and he also um, loved the sciences as well. And he had hoped to become a doctor at some point, but he didn't pursue that because he felt like the Latin, to quote him, the Latin puzzles me. He didn't want to learn it. So instead, he continued to be a farmer, and he also turned into a bit of a botanist and plant hunter for a number of folks in Europe who really wanted access to these American plants from the colonies. He has North Carolina ties. His father was one of the first Quaker settlers in North Carolina, and he lived in the Swansboro area. And however, during the Tuscarora War, he was killed. Well, let me back up. John Bartram and his brother were living up in Pennsylvania at the time with, I believe, their grandparents. So his father comes down to North Carolina, establishes a farm in Swansboro area. Tuscarora War happens. He gets killed, and John Bartram's stepmother and his half siblings get abducted. They were eventually ransomed, and they were taken back up to their family in Pennsylvania. Well, later on, John Bartram's little brother, William, wound up going back to North Carolina and purchasing a plantation down on the Cape Fear in what today is Bladen County. So he returned, even though he had a really rough childhood for a time. John Bartram himself, though, he is based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was one of the first people to cultivate cultivate the Venus flytrap and send leaf and seed specimens to England, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Him and Peter Collinson had this relationship where he would send Peter all these different plants that he was requesting. He would actually travel along the eastern seaboard looking for them. And of course, it's going to take a while for these things to travel because, you know, ship traffic in the 18th century is not very speedy. But this was also how he made money. So it wasn't just Peter Collinson. There were other fellows in England who he was getting paid for to obtain plants. And he is also the father of William Bartram, who we'll talk about in just a minute. All righty. So Arthur Dobbs. Arthur Dobbs is another player in all of this, was the royal governor of North Carolina, the one right before William Tryon. He was one of the most beloved royal governors of North Carolina. He was governor from 1754 to 65 for quite a while. Scottish born, raised in Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland, though. While he was in Ireland, he served as High Sheriff, Mayor of Carrickfergus, a member of the Irish Parliament, and he was also the 1733 Engineer and Surveyor General of Ireland. So he was a bit of a Renaissance man. He too was also heavily interested in the sciences, and he became a member of the Royal Society. He wrote pamphlets on the Aurora Borealis, and also was one of the first people to document pollination by insects. He wrote a pamphlet on how that the little bees, when they go from one plant to the other, they're carrying pollen fragments with them, and they like to pick up just one plant at a time. So they might hit up all the daisies first, then they might go to all the lavender. So he was one of the first people to document that. So he was very scientific minded. Well, on April the 2nd, 1759, him and Collinson had already been talking with each other, by the way, because they were both members of the Royal Society. He wrote a letter to Collinson saying, "We have a kind of catchfly sensitive which closes upon anything that touches it. It grows in latitude 34, but not in 35. I will try to save the seed here." Well, this sparked Collinson's interest because what does he mean by catchfly sensitive, right? Okay, he means some sort of plant that closes, it moves. A little bit later, he wrote again to Collinson, "The great wonder of the vegetable kingdom is a very curious unknown species of sensitive. It is a dwarf plant. The leaves are like a narrow segment of a sphere consisting of two parts, like the cap of a spring purse, the concave part outwards, each of which falls back with indented edges like an iron spring box trap. Upon anything touching the leaves or falling between them, they instantly close like a spring trap and confine any insect or anything that falls between them. It bears a white flower. To this surprising plant, I have given the name of flytrap sensitive. So Arthur Dobbs was the first person that we know of who actually wrote a description of this plant, starting April the 2nd and then later on the next year in January. So Collinson really wants this now. And so he continues to correspond with Dobbs, hoping Dobbs is going to send him one of these plants, let him know what's going on. And Dobbs is not really responding because he is running a colony and he's got a lot of things going on. So what Collinson then tries to do is send John Bartram down to North Carolina to see if he can get access to one of these plants. And John Bartram does that. He actually sends down his son, William. So William Bartram is a son. One of John Bartram had a few different sons. He is one of them. Later on, he would become known as a naturalist in his own right. But I consider him sort of a Charlie Brown of the 18th century because everything he tried to do, he seemed to fail at it. His dad really wanted him to get involved in the merchant business because he's like, you can make good money with this. You're going to fare well when I'm gone. And he had him apprenticed as a merchant. He wound up sending him down to the Cape Fear to work with his uncle, who is also named William. This gets a little confusing, by the way. There's a lot of Williams and Johns in this family. Sends him down to work with his uncle William in the Cape Fear as a merchant. You can see here, I found a little letter. This is in John Bartram's handwriting where he was mailing it to his son from Philadelphia. And I find it amusing that he just has to William Bartram, merchant in Cape Fear. And somehow that makes it from Philadelphia to Bladen County, but yeah, it did. So he didn't fare too well with that, being a merchant. Now, I don't know if it's because he didn't have the temperament for it. He just didn't, it wasn't jiving with him. I'm not sure. So then his father says, okay, well, I guess you love plants and things like that. Let's let you be a plantation owner. I will buy you a place down in what is northern Florida today, near Johns River, and you can grow oranges down there. Well, that failed too. He wound up losing that plantation. But what William was very good at was drawing and painting. He was an artist, and he was good at replicating what he saw and also talking about it, because a naturalist, they don't just draw pictures, they would also write diaries, journal articles, all of this, explaining what they saw, explaining what the weather was like, precursor to National Geographic in a way. He is what we believe one of the first to draw an image of the Venus flytrap in 1767. It is not to scale though. Okay, so there's your flytraps, and this is either a very tiny heron or a big flytrap, but yeah, it's not to scale. But that we believe is one of the first images of one. So what happens is that John Bartram and William Bartram do make a couple of trips down to where the governor was at the time. He was in a place called Brunswick, which is a town that doesn't exist anymore. It's an archaeological site today. They make the trip down and they talk with Governor Dobbs. And later on, William actually goes by himself to where the governor is as well. So now I have a bit of correspondence between John Bartram and Collinson regarding the flytraps. Right here, so I can. All right, so Collinson writes a letter to Bartram stating, Governor Dobbs has promised to send me seeds. Now, remember what I said earlier, that the seeds are not viable for very long. But Collinson doesn't know this. He's expecting to get those seeds because he wants to try growing these things. The next year, William Bartram to John Bartram. So William's already been exploring the Cape Fear. He's gone to speak with Governor Dobbs. He's telling his dad, I have sent you the most extraordinary beauty in the vegetable kingdom. that comical cysted plant which grows in the savannahs and nettle with the white flower. They are good roots. That means he sent the whole plant with the corm on the end, so he says it's healthy. It wound up, and this is not part of the quote, the last sentence, but they were on a ship. So they're going from the Cape Fear up to Pennsylvania, and they got lost in a storm. One of the things that would happen when you are shipping plants in the 18th century, it's light cargo. So if you are having problems aboard your vessel, it's one of the first things you're going to dump. So that is more than what happened in this case. They were dumped in order to spare the vessel. So John Bartram did not get the plants that time. They were lost at sea. 1762, this is John Bartram to Collinson. Now this is a bit teasing, I think. So he's writing him, telling him about there was a French guy from Montreal, came down and visited with him. He said, my little tippity witchet sensitive stimulates laughter in all ye beholders. There was lately a French gentleman from Montreal, which was so agitated that he could hardly stand. And that's a typo of mine. Said it was enough to make one burst with laughing. It seems to grow as well as in Carolina. How it will bear ye winter, I cannot say. Ye long-leaved Sarracina grows well. So he finally got some traps from William. He is growing them. It seems to be doing good. They've not gone through a winter, but he says the pitcher plants, the Sarracina, are doing well. So he thinks that the fly traps will too. Well, after that letter, one arrives back to Bartram from Collinson. I am impatient to see a specimen of the leaves and flower of the tippity witchet. Pray, good John, never let a letter pass without a specimen as it advances. Is it possible for Billy, William, to paint it? I am much concerned his affairs are encumbered. Pray take care of this singular plant and protect the root carefully against your severe weather. So good. He's really wanting this plant, and Bartram is not sending him anything. So that was October of 62. This is December of 62. So Collinson's not waiting around again. Whilst the Frenchman was ready to burst with laughing, he gets really dramatic here. I am ready to burst with desire for the root, seed, or specimen of the waggish tippity witchet sensitive. I wish Billy, when he was with thee, had taken at least a sketch of it to save my longing. But if I have not a specimen in thy next letter, never write me more. For it is cruel to tantalize me with relations and not send me a little specimen. In thine of the 15th of August, nor in thine of the 29th. It shows thou hast no sympathy or compassion. I wish it was in my power to mortify thee as much. This is where I like to think of Collinson as acting like a teenage girl at this point. They had been friends for a very long time, and he is very upset that Bartram has not sent him any plants. And we'll go back. I think that was October. This is December. In January, Bartram sends a letter back. He had sent plants. The problem was the average trip across the Atlantic at the time, let's say about 21 to 30 days. In fall of 1762, Bartram had sent plants over, and on the way, they were intercepted by Spanish privateers. So the Spanish come aboard this English merchant vessel. They're looking for goods that they can make money off of. If they open up a box and there's a bunch of plants inside, do you think that's what they really want? No. So it wound up a few months later, the plants did arrive. Somehow the Spanish wound up returning them. Of course, they were dead by that point. So you had specimens, but they didn't want them, these dead plants in a box. So in that case, it's funny, like you can have weather at the time can affect transporting these things across the ocean. And in this case, pirates got in the way of transporting these across the ocean. So Collinson's still upset. He does not have any plants. And And I just threw this one in here because I found it kind of funny. He's still upset with Arthur Dobbs because Arthur Dobbs won't send him anything. So in June of '64, he says, I hear my friend Dobbs at 73 has got a colt's tooth in his head and has married a young lady at 22. She was actually younger. She was in her teens. It is now in vain to write him for seeds or plants of the tippity witchet now that he's got his own to play with. So the first living Venus flytrap would arrive in England in 1768. And it was actually imported by a competitor of William Bartram, a fellow named William Young Jr. And he found a way to be able to box the plants up to allow for a live shipment. And so, again, they arrived in 1768. So Collinson had to wait for not quite a decade in order to get this plant in his presence. So one of the guys who helped to get the live plants over and was also heavily involved with science at the time was a fellow named John Ellis. He was also a cloth merchant. However, he was appointed as the king's agent to the province of West Florida, and later as the colonial agent for the island of Dominica, so like basically an auditor. He had a big interest in marine biology in addition to botany, and he was conducting experiments on how to best transport seeds at the time. And he actually has these great, inside this book here, he has great drawings of how to package them up and everything, so to make shipment less harsh on these plants, because it's taken about a month for them to cross the ocean. He was the first to publish a description of the Venus flytrap in 1770. And inside this little book right here, his directions, let me see if I can read the title for you. Directions for bringing over seeds and plants from the East Indies and other distant countries. Let's see, and he keeps going on. These titles in the 18th century are so long. And then he has a description of the Dionea muscipula, the Venus flytrap in there as well. And he has a really nice image that he drew of it. So it was the first time it actually, anything on it had actually been published for the general public. And this is going to spark a lot of interest from the scientific community in studying this. And now that they do have plants in England, it's going to be very helpful for them to have access to it. So another fellow that Collinson was working with was Carl Linnaeus. This is the guy who came up with taxonomy, all the Latin names and how we categorize that. So he was good friends with this Swedish biologist. So immediately, once he had access to those specimens that John Bartram had sent him, the bits of plant pieces, dried and everything, he sent them to Linnaeus for him to have a look at. And Linnaeus thought that these plants were very bizarre. Like, there should not be any plants that are eating other things. That's against the true nature of how God made things. But this guy, he also had written that he thought that pitcher plants were just providing water for other insects for the insects to drink, and they were not eating them. So he was a little wrong on that. His follower, Daniel Solander, was one of his favorite students. He was persuaded by Collinson and Ellis, the previous fellow, to come over to England to try to promote this taxonomy system, so to make sure that all scientists were using this. He was the one who assigned the botanical name Dionea muscipula to the Venus flytrap. And so in that name, it means daughter of Dion or Aphrodite, and mus is Dionea, and mus means mouse or flytrap. So it literally is Venus flytrap. All right, so we're going to go forward into time. So your biggest threats to Venus flytraps today, and why their range has shrunk drastically, is habitat development. I mean, habitat destruction, which is caused by development. So it can be either from just completely destroying them on a property and then building on it, or it can be from changing the ecosystem, that you're somewhere adjacent to where those fly traps are growing, you are building structures, you're bringing in a lot of fill dirt, and then that's changing the pH of the ground. So there's a number of different ways that development can destroy them. You can make areas that were not as waterlogged, now they're waterlogged, and it basically drowns the plants. And fire suppression, because they are very low to the ground. So they have to have fire to come in and burn off all the higher brush. Otherwise, they're going to get choked out and they can't get the light that they need in order to live. And then poaching is a big issue. And there's some movements in alternative medicine thinking that there's something in these plants that will help to cure cancer. That's why we need to harvest them. The problem is these guys are very easy to grow either by propagation, by growing it by seed, or by cell culture, where you take like little pieces off and then you can, they grow like from pieces of the plant. Poaching them out in the wild is not a sustainable way in order to, you can't keep the population going if you're doing that. It's not a sustainable way to grow them. So that is a huge problem. And so I threw this in here about the green swamp related to habitat. So I live right down in here, okay? And the green swamp historically is this huge swamp that covered a good portion of Brunswick County and Columbus County, which is this area right here. Brunswick County is over here. Well, in the early 1900s, you had big developers coming in, not to put in houses, but to farm lumber. And once they got rid of the lumber, like, okay, we can use this for farming now. So what they did is they put in a lot of canals, drainage canals in here in order to drain the swamp, so that where they've cut the lumber, then you can put farming establishments in here. Well, now the green swamp is much more limited in size. It's basically here. This is the property that belongs to the Nature Conservancy right here. So very small. So your historical area, and now what we have left today, Juniper Creek and Lake Waccamaw State Park up here. So, and then the development just continues to encroach because you have your beaches along here, and it's just getting further and further out. So we're losing a lot of that historical area where these things grow in the wild. So where can you see the Venus flytraps in the wild? A few spots. I tried, a lot of these are down closer to me, of course, because it's where I've seen them, where I've hiked and everything. If you're ever down in Wilmington, the Stanley Reeder Carnivorous Plant Garden, which is located basically in the center of Wilmington, Carolina Beach State Park. In Pender County, you've got Holly Shelter Game Land as well. And here, well, near here, we have Croatan National Forest. I'm not exactly sure where they are. I just know they're there, so I can't give you details on that. Then the Green Swamp Nature Preserve in Supply. Now, on my way up here, I saw that the coastal, oh gosh, I just lost the track of what it's called. North Carolina Coastal, yes, they have a trail over near Bogue. I don't know if they're there. I feel like in the past I've read they might be there. So I'm going to check that out on my way back today and see if there are any there. Of course, I don't have the shoes on to wear for that, but oh well, it's okay. All right. So any questions about anything? Good. All right. Thank you.